Well, today we are continuing in Exodus chapter 20. So grab a Bible. If you don't have one, probably can find one underneath the row of chairs in front of you. If you're using one of those Bibles, the page number you want is 61. Exodus chapter 20, page 61. Today we come to the fourth commandment. I want to begin reading for you in verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the seventh day, and made it holy. I was talking to a person here in Stanfield, it's been several months ago. He's a really respected individual in our community, and he has been at times the coach of my son's AAU basketball team. It was one of those conversations that was awkward for me to have, because I do respect him and don't want to give unnecessary offense. But it concerned the schedule for the games. And AAU basketball, you probably know this, takes place during the weekends. And so I simply had to tell the coach that my son, I'm happy to have him play on the team, but he will not be playing on Sundays. I don't think the individual I was talking to really had the ability to understand what I was saying. He was respectful, which I greatly appreciated. It was not at all adversarial. But I don't think he was able to understand the concern that I was expressing. And by the way, the concern went a lot farther than I'm the pastor of the Stanfield Baptist Church, my kids need to be in church, other kids can do whatever they want. That was not the gist of, in other words, I was not saying I got to protect my reputation. Instead, it really was getting to the core of what this text is about. I'm entitling the message this way: God's right to rule over our time. Sabbath worship will not make sense to you unless you are able to recognize that what the Bible is in fact saying here is that God, as sovereign ruler, has a right over your time and over my time. So the Ten Commandments are not the 10 grand suggestions. God does not say, do this if it feels right or makes sense in your family context. Although I would be the first to say there is so much blessing in keeping the 10 Commandments. It is for our good. But the sovereignty of God does shine brightly in this particular passage of Scripture. A couple of years ago, I was out on a Saturday night. I don't remember all the details, but I know I was trying to locate a motel room for someone who was passing through our community or was in some need. It was winter, I suppose. It was probably quite cold. Anyway, I was motivated to go into Hermiston and to try to find a motel room. And what I discovered was that every motel virtually was sold out. I went into one of these motels, actually the Oxford Suites, the nicest motel probably in Hermiston. When you're desperate to find a room, you know, you go wherever you got to go. And they helped me because they started making phone calls. They called virtually every motel in town until we finally found one room at a sort of undesirable location, but it was a room that was available. And why there were no rooms in all of Hermiston was because there was a grade school age basketball tournament that weekend. And so all the motels of Hermiston were filled with 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders. And as I sat there and just took this in, and actually I took it with my eyes as well, because, and my ears, because 3rd, 4th, 5th graders are not the quietest segment of our population. And so they were busy running around the entryway there at the Oxford Suites. I did ask the question, how could I not ask the question on a Saturday night, how many of those kids will be in church on Sunday morning? And my suspicion is, of course, that probably none of them were in church on Sunday morning. In the conversation with the coach, I simply, he's about 20 years behind me in age. And by the way, what I'm going to say next really does, I'm not really old enough to remember this, but I've heard about it. But I'm 49, so he's late, probably 29 or so. I said to him, have you ever heard of Blue Laws? And that was an absolutely foreign concept to him. Probably is to some of you. I won't make you raise your hand, but how many of you have never heard of Blue Laws? I didn't say to raise your hand. Are you raising your hand because you've never heard of them, or because you have heard of them? I guess it doesn't matter. My grandparents knew about Blue Laws because they grew up in a world where those kinds of rules were still kept. Blue Laws were laws that tried to keep Sunday as a special day. So they were laws that mandated that only essential services were open on a Sunday morning. Obviously, I'm glad that law enforcement works on Sunday mornings, aren't you? I'm glad that the fire department answers fire calls on Sundays. I'm glad the hospital is open. But I think probably in a lot of towns, there would maybe be one restaurant open on Sunday. And this was planned and arranged, probably shared. Or one service station open on a Sunday. Because you see, there was a cultural value that church attendance, worship, giving God time out of our week, resting, these were all cultural values. And so the reality that Blue Laws are fading into the past, are virtually unknown by the younger generation, that to me is just another reminder of how secular our culture has indeed become. And so it's another reminder that we as a culture do not recognize God's right to rule over our time. As we look at the 4th commandment today, I want to begin by sharing 4 affirmations with you. And I've got to tell you that I found unusual enjoyment of my study of the 4th commandment this week. I did a lot of reading, a lot of thinking. The first affirmation that I would share with you, I've already made this statement. We are to remember that, well, I haven't stated it quite this way. We are to remember that every day belongs to God. Not just the Sabbath day. No, I think that what we read here is that every day belongs to God. So we begin in verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. To be holy means to be set apart. We talked about this last week, didn't we? That profane, by definition, means common or ordinary. The opposite is holy, that which is sacred, that which is set apart, that which we say is special to us. It's really unfortunate, I don't know where the Vanderstelts are today, but little Sam Vanderstelt has been reminding me weekly for the last month that this is the Sunday when we would sing happy birthday to him. And they're gone. I had a note, a little sticky note on my sermon notes this morning, Sam Vanderstelt's birthday. There was no way I was going to allow us to forget this. Because you see, in Sam Vanderstelt's mind, his birthday is a sacred day, isn't it? It's not an ordinary day, not a common day. It's a special day. And he wants all of us to remember him on that special day. So when we read in verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, don't think of holy so much as incense or a particular style of worship, or any of that. It's just the idea of something that is set apart. It's not ordinary. But then in verse 9, notice what we read. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. The word Sabbath means a day of rest. But he also makes mention, the text also makes mention of the 6 days in which you shall labor. To me, that's saying that God really controls every day. By the way, I don't think he's saying here that it's illegitimate to have 2 days off. I know some people do feel that way. I've been told this before. I think what the Bible's saying here is that God has given you 6 days to complete your labor. 6 days he's given to you in that sense. I want to read to you the words of Thomas Watson. Now, let me say that reading Thomas Watson to you is a little bit dangerous because this is very old English. We don't really talk this way today. But the observation that he makes is so good that I want to read this to you because it puts the Sabbath day in a different perspective. Do you begrudge having to give God a Sabbath? Does it inconvenience you? Does it crimp your style? Well, then listen to what Watson says. Now, he's speaking for God. So imagine, this is God speaking to you in kind of old King James type English. God says, I'm not a hard master. I do not grudge thee time to look after thy calling and get in estate. I have given thee 6 days to do all thy work in, and have taken but one for myself. I might have reserved 6 days for myself and allowed thee but one. But I have given thee 6 days for the works of thy calling, and have taken but 1 day for my own service. It is just and rational, therefore, that thou shouldest set this day in a special manner apart for my worship. Do you get the point Watson's trying to drive home? It's obvious, isn't it? God could have set it up differently. He could have said, you have 1 day out of the week to do what you want to do, and you have 6 days of the week to come and worship me. But no, God only asks us to give 1 day, to set 1 day apart for the purpose of focusing on Him, of worshiping Him in a corporate kind of way. The second affirmation I want to make is this. The Sabbath is centered upon the joyful worship of God. One of the aha moments that I had this week is the realization that the Sabbath is meant to be a celebration. It's meant to be a holiday. Do you begrudge Christmas? Do you begrudge holidays? You don't, do you? The word holiday simply means holy day. It's a day set apart. And so to think of the Sabbath as a holiday, where God in His grace and mercy has given us 1 day out of the week, and we are to receive it as an opportunity to rest, to celebrate Him, to rejoice uniquely in this day. So we should not view this day as a drudgery, and if we do, we are indeed dishonoring God. The third affirmation. The Sabbath is a day for remembering and honoring God as our Creator and as our Redeemer. Notice what the text actually says in Exodus chapter 20, verse 11. After stipulating that every part of society is called to rest and to celebrate, to honor this day, verse 11, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the seventh day, and He made it holy. Now, I also want to read to you from Deuteronomy chapter 5. I'm going to ask you to turn with me to that text, page 150 in the Church Bible. Deuteronomy chapter 5. And the reason I'm doing this is because you have the Ten Commandments stated again in the book of Deuteronomy. And so the fourth commandment is given to us, but then in verse 15, there's something new that's attached. I want to draw your attention to this something new. Trying to answer the question, well, why is it that we are called to honor the Sabbath? We're called to celebrate it, to worship. Well, why? What's the reason for this? So Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 15 reads this way, "You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. And the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." And so when you put these two passages together, it seems to me what God is saying, you are to set apart the Sabbath day to recognize that I am the creator of all life. You're also to set the Sabbath day apart to recognize that I am your great Redeemer. So the word remember, if you know the Bible very well, you recognize, particularly in the Old Testament, but really in all of the Bible, the word remember is a particularly important word. When a group of people have a bad memory, that group of people very often ends up practicing idolatry. The Bible is repeatedly telling us, remember. Remember who God is. Remember what God has done for you. Because if you don't remember who God is, you won't be able to rightly identify who you are. That's so true. People in our culture are lost. And the fundamental problem, they're lost because they don't know who God is. A knowledge of God and a knowledge of self are closely connected together. So to remember that God is the creator, that you are created in His very image, that you have worth and you have value, every one of you here today, because you are uniquely created in the very image of God. For the children of Israel to have this weekly celebration, this day set apart to focus on worship, to rest in the presence of God, and to remember the Exodus experience, which in the Old Testament is the great story of redemption, isn't it? Let us remember what God has done for us, how He saved us. We were in slavery in Egypt. We were without a future. We were without a hope. But this God, the God of the Bible, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, this God remembered us. He took mercy upon us. He broke the chains that bound us. He saved us when we could not save ourselves. And of course, we recognize that as New Testament believers, we also look back and are asked to remember the great work of redemption, the work of Christ, by which we've been set free from the penalty of our sins, by which, as we function out of the gospel, we are being set free from the power of sin within us, and the realization that someday in our heavenly rest, we will be set free from the very presence of sin. So God in His wisdom is saying to us, you people, creaturely people, forgetful people, you need to have written into your style of life, into your weekly habit, a special time when you gather together and you are invited to remember the greatness and the goodness of God, and to give thanks, and to rejoice, and to worship and to celebrate. That there is something wrong, there is something out of place when we forsake that time which God has graciously given to us so that we can celebrate Him and enjoy His presence. Fourth and finally, in terms of these affirmations, the Sabbath is a day that is meant to be protected. I want to show you this from the book of Nehemiah. I realize that's not a book we spend much time in, but I'm going to ask you to try to find with me the book of Nehemiah. The 400 in the church Bible, and then go to chapter 13, Nehemiah chapter 13, it's page 409. Do you remember what Nehemiah is about? Let's do a little Bible quizzing. What's the theme of the book of Nehemiah? What is this man doing? For what purpose? To rebuild the wall. Because the Babylonians have come through the land and they've destroyed the city, they've taken away the nation's independence, the people have been in slavery, now they've come back to the land. Nehemiah is a person of influence. He knows the wall of Jerusalem is in ruins, and so his singular mission is to come back to the city that the wall may be rebuilt. Is he successful? I'm going to say he's pretty successful because the wall is rebuilt and it's done in a pretty record time. Now, we're towards the end of the book, and Nehemiah, this man, the book is named after him, he has been absent from the city and now he has returned. So with that background, I want to begin reading for you in Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 15. In those days I saw in Judah people treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in heaps of grain, and loading them on donkeys, and also wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them on that day when they sold food. Tyrians, so these are people from Tyre. These are not Jewish people. These are outside individuals. They're businessmen. The point of this verse is that they're conducting business. It's a normal, ordinary day. Tyrians also, who lived in the city, brought in fish and all kinds of goods and sold them on the Sabbath to the people of Judah in Jerusalem itself. Then I confronted the nobles of Judah, and I said to them, "What is this evil thing that you are doing, profaning the Sabbath day?" Remember, to profane is not a wicked word. To profane simply means to treat as ordinary. You're treating the Sabbath day as if it's a Tuesday, or a Wednesday, or a Thursday. You're not remembering to set apart this particular day. Now, I know what happens at this point. Some of you are thinking he's moving into legalism. I don't think I am. Again, the Ten Commandments are not the 10 suggestions. Did not your fathers act in this way, and did not our God bring all this disaster on us and on this city? Now you are bringing more wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. Verse 19. As soon as it began to grow dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut, and I gave orders that they should not be opened until after the Sabbath. And I stationed some of my servants at the gates, that no load might be brought in on the Sabbath day. Then the merchants and sellers and all kinds of wares lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice. But I warned them, and I said to them, "Why do you lodge outside the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you." From that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves and come and guard the gates, to keep the Sabbath day holy. Remember this also in my favor, O God, and spare me according to the greatness of your steadfast love. Now I want to make an application from that Old Testament text. I realize we're not living in a theocracy. I realize our culture is secular. I realize that there is movement in redemptive history between the day of Nehemiah and our day today. I still want to make an application from that text, and I want to make the application directly to parents, to moms, to dads, perhaps even to grandparents. And I want to encourage you and challenge you to think in your own mind, is it necessary for me to be a Nehemiah in my family? Nehemiah was willing to stand against the current. Nehemiah was willing to say, everything in Jerusalem goes on. It's the Sabbath day. They treat it like it's a Wednesday. Nehemiah was willing to say, we should not do this. And so I'm asking you, as a mom or a dad, do you need to take the initiative and to begin to shepherd your own children and to begin to teach them and say, this day is set apart. It is not an ordinary day, and we will not treat it as such. One of the things that has struck me about preaching through the Ten Commandments, and I don't think I anticipated this when I started, is just simply how theocentric they are. That word means that God is at the center. The Greek word theos means God. These Ten Commandments are about the centrality of God. Commandment number 1, you remember? His exclusivity. The one true God. Commandment number 2, His transcendence. He is high and holy and above all. Commandment number 3, honoring the holiness of His name. Commandment number 4, recognizing that God is sovereign over our days, over our time, over this day. So as we apply that to our lives, there's this realization that God is the author of a story, and we are encouraged to be part of that story, but it's God's story, not our story. And that's part of our problem as a culture. I don't know if you recognize this. We live in a culture, I think, unparalleled perhaps in all of human history, where self is enthroned as God. Recently, my children were filling out some sort of a form and they were writing, I don't remember exactly the detail. I encourage them, don't use the word gender. Use the word sex. Because the word gender has been stolen in our culture, hasn't it? When you talk about the autonomous self, self-rule, I define everything for myself. I even define whether I'm male or female or somewhere in between. We talk about reproductive rights, taking of life. I define that for myself. I make all the rules because I am my own little God. That is our culture. End of life? Well, you can't possibly think that I would leave the day of my death, the moment of my death, in the hands of a sovereign God. No, I will take a little pill, and I will choose to check out when I think it is appropriate, because I rule over my time, God does not. Now, I share those examples with you not to pick a fight, but to make a point. All of those are examples of a bigger, more fundamental problem. We don't want to submit to God. We don't want God to tell us what to do and when to do it. So the autonomous self-rule, where I define everything in my life, who I'm with, when I'm with them. It's all up to me. And the Ten Commandments come into that way of thinking with a sledgehammer. And they say to us, no, there is a sovereign God. And yes, you are to have an exclusive commitment to Him. And yes, He is transcendent. Imagine it. He actually rules over your days. God actually is arrogant enough to think that He should have authority in your life. And I don't mean that God is arrogant. God is simply sovereign. You see, there is this radical centrality of who God is in these commandments. But we are to recognize, beloved, that God rules in our lives for our good. Because stop and think with me. When you look at the culture, is the culture happy? Is the culture healthy? Does doing it our own way work out well for us? It doesn't, does it? Our culture is profoundly broken. And so we should recognize that God being at the very center is also God's way of inviting us into a relationship that is rightly ordered, and out of that relationship comes joy for us. But moms and dads, your kids are living in this culture. So one of the takeaways from my study of the Ten Commandments, and I have not done well at this at all. Very convicting. What do I need to do as a father to put guardrails around the Sabbath day to protect my children? But more than that, here's the new thought. How do I take the Sabbath day and make it for them the sweetest, the best day of the week? A day that they actually look forward to. Because it's a celebration. It's a holiday. Again, it's the idea. Your kids don't begrudge Christmas, do they? No, they love Christmas. They love their birthdays. How can I take this day, take it back from the culture so it's no longer treated as something cheap and profane, and make it sacred and make it special so that my children want this day to come? Make it the best day of the week. And I don't think I've done well with that. I think part of the reason I've not done well with that is, quite frankly, is I'm a pastor. Sunday mornings are hectic for me. I leave all my kids in bed. And as one of you discovered recently, in an angry phone call home to one of my kids, you better get up and get down here. So this would be an admonishment to you, but also an encouragement to you. As parents, as grandparents, have you thought seriously, how do I make the Sabbath a joy for my children? Is there something special about this day? Maybe it's a Sunday morning or Sunday afternoon activity. Here's a suggestion for you. I would encourage all parents to consider confiscating all smartphones and locking them up on Sundays. Now, my kids are thinking, what? I thought he said it's a special day. But you know what those phones do, don't you? I'm not kidding. I'm always ready to get rid of my smartphone and go back to a flip phone. Because you know, the phones, they just take us and they draw us just like this. Instead of being up and aware and looking outward, they just draw us so that we begin to worship the phone. You're just surfing, and it's mindless. It's not evil or wrong, but it's mindless. How can you take this day and make it set apart? Truly make it a celebration. That is the challenge, I think, of the text for us this morning. Now, before we close, I've got to indulge a side discussion because I know that for some of you, it's in your minds. And so I'm going to do this, but I want to tell you up front that I'm done with the sermon in terms of what I think is really the most significant part. The New Testament Lord's Day. Some of you probably don't realize this, you don't really think about it, but we worship on Sunday, don't we? And what do we know about the Sabbath? The Sabbath is Saturday. And so the question becomes for certain individuals, and there are people in our church I know who wrestle with this issue, well, why do we worship on Sunday rather than Saturday, and is that even legitimate? I'm not going to go into all the details of this, but I'm going to try to address just two questions. I'm going to try to provide answers to two questions. So the first one is this. When did Sunday worship begin? I'm going to ask you to turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 16. Corinthians chapter 16. Page 962. When was 1 Corinthians written? Anyone want to suggest a date, roughly? You got a study Bible that helps you with that? AD 52, maybe? AD 50? I didn't look it up, actually. Middle of the first century. By the way, how established is the Catholic Church by 50 AD? There are a lot of popes. Now, what do we read? Chapter 16, beginning in verse 1. Now, concerning the collection for the saints, this is an offering that Paul had initiated, and it was for the relief of people in the city of Jerusalem. Now, concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week. Now, what is the first day of every week? Sunday. Now, what is being described here? A worship service. This is corporate worship. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up, so that he may prosper, so that there be no collecting when I come. That's not an explicit argument. It's more what we would call implicit. That is to say, it's simply describing what the church in the middle of the first century was actually doing. And what they're actually doing is gathering on the first day of the week for corporate worship, and Paul directs them in terms of an offering that is to be taken, and is taken on the first day of the week. Go with me to Acts chapter 20. Acts chapter 20, page 929. Acts chapter 20 is one of these passages that all preachers love. Because Acts chapter 20 records for us a very lengthy sermon. It's a sermon that went on for so long, there were young people in the building, and they were yawning, and one of them fell asleep. Perhaps it was warm in the room. We don't know. I assume it was warm. It led him to an open window. Imagine him sitting on the ledge of an open window on the third story. And as he fell asleep, you know what happened, don't you? He fell out of the window. He fell 3 stories down, and he died. Remember his name? His name is Eutychus. Eutychus means lucky one. You see, there is some humor in this text. I think his name really was Eutychus. But the name portrays how the story ends, doesn't it? Paul goes down, and Paul raises this young person from death. And so he is, when the story closes, truly the fortunate, the favored, the lucky one. Now, Acts chapter 20, verse 7, we read these words. On the first day of the week. What's the first day of the week? Sunday. When was Acts chapter 20 written? During Paul's missionary journeys. In other words, the point I'm making is these statements I'm reading to you are in the age of the apostles. So Paul is talking about at Corinth, he says, when you come together on the Lord's Day because you're having a worship service and it's on Sunday, well, clearly Paul is approving of this. And Paul's an apostle. Or in this text, on the first day of the week, well, Paul's present in the room. He's the preacher, for crying out loud. Surely Paul must approve of worshiping on Sunday because he himself is leading a worship service on this day. He says, when you are gathered together to break bread, probably that's communion and the idea of the love feast, which we know was present in the first century. Paul talked with them, and Paul preached with them. And he prolonged his speech until midnight. And the young man calls from the room. Perhaps it's a Sunday evening service, probably is. But the point being, here we have examples where the church is worshiping not on the Sabbath, but on the Lord's Day. And it's not in the 4th century that this is happening, it's in the middle of the 1st century. One other text, just to try to make this point. In Revelation chapter 1, verse 10, we read of John and of his practice of worship. Now, where is John in Revelation chapter 1? Do you remember? Patmos. And why is he there? He's been exiled. And so I'm reading in a little bit, but I think this is probably the way we're to understand this verse. In chapter 1, verse 10, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. Now, what's the Lord's Day? Sunday. I think what we have here is that John is worshiping on the Lord's Day, and he's doing this because he's on this little island. He's isolated from the churches of Asia Minor, from Ephesus, for instance, and he knows that the saints there are worshiping on the Lord's Day, and so he's joining them in their worship. He's by himself, but he's praying, he's worshiping, knowing that they are doing the very same thing. Let me read to you, I've got to find these words. Here they are. I'm quoting Philip Ryken. He says, Christ's saving work has transformed the weekly Sabbath. It is no longer the 7th day of the week, but the first. And is no longer called the Sabbath, but the Lord's Day. This is because the apostles observed their day of worship and rest on the day that Jesus rose from the dead. Already by the end of the 1st century, Ignatius, one of the church fathers, was able to write about Christians. No longer observed the Sabbath day, but they directed their lives towards the Lord's Day, on which our life is refreshed by Him and by His death. Or E.B. Warfield explained it this way: Christ took the Sabbath into the grave with him and brought the Lord's Day out of the grave with him on the resurrection morn. One more passage. Would you please turn with me to the book of Colossians? See, this becomes such a serious issue because, whether you know this or not, Seventh-day Adventists refer to the Lord's Day as the mark of the beast. Some of them are very emphatic in saying that what we do by worshiping on Sunday is absolutely wrong. But notice what Paul says here in Colossians chapter 2, beginning in verse 16. He says, "Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ." These are a shadow of the things to come. So I want to suggest to you that what the New Testament points us in the direction of affirming is that the apostles and the Christians of the first century, they looked at the resurrection of Christ, which took place on the Lord's Day, the first day of the week, Sunday, and they said, rightly, now, in the New Testament age, in the age of the church, the New Testament church, clearly this day, the Lord's Day, trumps all other days. It is the most important of all days, because on this day, we celebrate the resurrection of Christ, which means on this day, we remember our redemption. And then we read Paul's explanation of this. He says, the Sabbath was a shadow of the things to come. See, shadows in the Old Testament, they pass away, don't they? They're replaced by something better and more permanent. This would take us into a deeper discussion, but circumcision in the Old Testament has been replaced by what in the New Testament? What? Baptism. Circumcision was a shadow of sorts. It was for a time, for a moment, but it's been replaced by something better and more permanent. And so I think we are to view the Sabbath day through this grid that the New Testament suggests that we view it through. So there are parts of the fourth commandment that are temporary in that they are modified, and there are parts of the fourth commandment that are permanent and still binding upon us today. I think that Peter, Paul, and the other apostles simply had this realization: it would be wrong for Christians to worship on the Sabbath because the Lord's Day is the day that God has set apart. It's the day of all days. This is the holy day. And so the church in its wisdom, not the Pope, in my opinion, this is not a 4th century or a medieval decision. No, as I have demonstrated to you, the church of the 1st century, under the authority of Peter and Paul and John, is worshiping on the Lord's Day in honor of the celebration of the resurrection of Christ, our great Redeemer. Let's pray. Father God, I do just come to you today, and I guess my prayer as I close would be that the last third of what I shared today would not overshadow what I think is far more important, which is this idea of honoring you with our time. And I would pray for our parents and our grandparents specifically this morning. And I would pray that you would help us, cause us to do some soul-searching, some serious thinking, some strategizing, that we might find ways to take the Lord's Day and to set it apart as a day of celebration, that we might bless our children, and that this day might be realized in our families as you intended it. We praise you, we thank you for our Redeemer and for our redemption. We pray in Jesus' name.